Clinging to the steel hull of a roaring T-34, Soviet soldiers rode straight into hell. No cover, no protection, just flesh and bone strapped to a moving target. To the enemy, they were the first and easiest kills. To their own commanders, they were expendable human armor. On the Eastern Front, being a tank rider wasn't a duty, it was a death sentence. On the Eastern Front, where entire armies clashed across endless steppes, forests, and ruined cities, the Soviet Union developed a brutal tactic that turned men into shields. Infantrymen, often with no trucks or armored carriers to move them, were ordered to mount the very tanks that spearheaded the Red Army's advances. These soldiers became known as tank riders, clinging to turrets, gripping steel handles, or simply hanging on to whatever part of the T-34 or KV tank they could find. In theory, this was brilliant. The infantry advanced with the armor, ready to dismount and fight the moment German defenses were engaged. In reality, it was a death sentence. Propaganda posters showed smiling Red Army troops perched atop tanks, waving flags of victory, riding into battle as a combined fist of steel and flesh. But the truth was far darker. A tank rider was the most exposed soldier on the battlefield. With no armor, no cover, and nowhere to run, they were the first to take the full fury of German firepower. Every machine gun, every anti-tank round, every mortar shell that targeted a tank inevitably tore through the riders first. They weren't just soldiers riding to battle. They were human armor strapped to the Red Army's most valuable war machines. For commanders, the tactic was practical. It kept infantry from falling behind the tanks, prevented armored spearheads from being isolated, and gave the Red Army the aggressive punch it needed to break through German lines. But for the men themselves, the reality was terrifying. Many climbed onto tanks knowing the odds of survival were slim. They were not just riding into battle. They were riding into the jaws of death, clinging to steel beasts that could, at any moment, become their tombs. A tank was supposed to be protection, a rolling fortress of steel. But for Soviet tank riders sitting exposed on its hull, it was the exact opposite. On the open decks of a T-34, there was no armor plate to crouch behind, no trench to dive into, no wall to hug for cover. A tank rolling forward into battle drew every eye, every trigger, every scope. The first thing German soldiers saw wasn't the tank. It was the dozen men perched helplessly on top of it. And so they fired at the soft targets first. Machine guns stitched the riders with fire before the tank even reached the front line. German MG-34s and MG-42s were merciless, sweeping across tank riders like scythes. Snipers zeroed in on exposed heads and torsos, knocking men from the tank one by one. Artillery gunners didn't hesitate to aim at the infantry clinging to armor, knowing that shrapnel and concussive blasts would shred the riders even if the tank survived. For the men clinging on, the experience was pure terror. Imagine gripping cold steel while bullets slammed into the tank's hull beneath you, sparks flying as rounds ricocheted inches from your body. There was no ducking, no cover, just the hope that the tank moved fast enough or that the enemy's aim missed you by chance. Survivors later said that being a tank rider meant going into combat with death practically guaranteed. The moment you climbed onto that hull, you were the first to be targeted, the first to be cut down, and the least likely to walk away alive. If German machine guns were deadly, artillery and mortars were apocalyptic for tank riders. On the Eastern Front, battles were often preceded or interrupted by massive barrages that churned earth into fire and steel. For riders sitting in the open, even a shell landing nearby was catastrophic. Shrapnel doesn't care about armor when men are sitting above it. Explosions tore riders apart, blew them from their perches, or left them broken on the ground before the tank crew inside even realized what had happened. Entire groups of riders could vanish in a single hit. Survivors recalled the horror of watching comrades beside them disintegrate, one moment clinging to the turret, the next ripped apart by a rain of steel fragments. The tanks themselves often kept rolling, oblivious to the carnage on their backs. To German gunners, tank riders were soft targets of opportunity. One well-placed mortar round could wipe out an entire squad before they ever dismounted. And the psychological toll was immense. Tank riders lived with the constant knowledge that they weren't just vulnerable. They were magnets for artillery. The sheer volume of German firepower meant every battlefield crossing was a gamble. For many, it was not the fear of being shot that haunted them most, but the randomness of shrapnel, unseen, unstoppable, and capable of ending a life in an instant. If riding atop a tank was dangerous, staying aboard when the tank itself was hit was often fatal. German armor-piercing rounds didn't just destroy tanks, they turned them into crematoriums. When a shell punched through a T-34 or KV's armor, the tank erupted in flames. Fuel sprayed like liquid fire, ammunition inside cooked off in chain reactions, and the entire machine became an inferno. For the crew inside, survival was slim. For riders clinging outside, the choice was even more gruesome. If they stayed aboard, the explosion could kill them instantly or engulf them in burning fuel. Many tank riders burned alive on the hulls, their bodies fused to the steel. Others, faced with that horror, chose to jump. But where could they go? Many leapt into minefields or into the teeth of German machine guns, preferring to take their chances on the ground rather than ride a burning coffin. Survivors described the chilling screams of riders who couldn't dismount in time, their uniforms catching fire as they tried to leap clear. Some were thrown off by the force of the blast itself, injured but alive. For tank riders, the sight of another tank going up in flames was the most terrifying vision of all, a reminder that at any moment their steel mount could become their executioner. German defenses on the Eastern Front weren't just walls of steel and firepower. They were riddled with deadly traps hidden beneath the soil. Tank riders dreaded mines as much as enemy guns, because when the tank they clung to rolled over one, they often became the first casualties. A mine might merely cripple the tank by blowing off its tracks, leaving the crew shaken but alive. But the shockwave, flying debris, and the violent lurch could hurl riders off the hull like rag dolls. Those unlucky enough to be thrown forward often landed directly into kill zones, swept by German rifles and machine guns. The reality was even worse when larger anti-tank mines detonated. Blast waves tore men apart, sending shrapnel slicing through exposed bodies. Sometimes the tank itself absorbed the explosion, but riders on the decks were torn apart by the concussion, bloodied before they even touched the ground. Soviet doctrine considered riders expendable in such situations. The priority was always keeping the tank rolling, not preserving the men riding it. For survivors, minefields were nightmares without warning. They often dismounted too late, realizing only when the lead tank exploded in front of them that they were driving directly into death. Many described the sheer helplessness, clinging to armor, knowing they were seconds away from being blown sky high with no way to avoid it. Mines turned the battlefield into a lottery of survival, and for tank riders, the odds were never in their favor. Soviet military doctrine demanded that tank riders dismount just before tanks reached enemy strongpoints, turning into shock infantry that stormed trenches and bunkers. In theory, this made sense. The tanks suppressed defenses, while riders delivered the final blow. In reality, the dismount was chaos. Imagine leaping off a moving tank into mud, snow, or shell-cratered ground while enemy machine guns opened fire. Men stumbled, fell, or landed hard enough to break bones. Before they could even raise their rifles, they were targets in the open. Timing was everything, but battle rarely allowed for precision. Some riders dismounted too early, leaving themselves stranded in no man's land with no cover. Others waited too long, leaping into a storm of bullets, or even dying as they clung desperately to tanks that were already ablaze. Survivors recalled the panic of hitting the ground, ears ringing, lungs gasping in dust and smoke, only to see comrades cut down in the first few steps forward. And yet, there was no hesitation allowed. Orders were orders. Men who faltered faced execution by commissars or were branded cowards. So they jumped, knowing full well that half their squad might not make it to the enemy trenches. Dismounting into chaos was less a tactic than a ritual sacrifice, one repeated across hundreds of battlefields until the final push into Germany. If the battlefield dangers weren't enough, the psychological strain of being a tank rider was crushing. Every mission was a gamble, every climb onto the hull a reminder that survival was unlikely. Veterans spoke of wiping fresh blood from turrets before taking their places, a grim ritual that left no illusions about what awaited them. The constant knowledge that their role was suicidal weighed heavily on morale. The sounds alone were haunting. Bullets pinging off steel inches away, the deafening roar of tank engines beneath them, and the clatter of tracks grinding forward through minefields. It all became a nerve-shattering symphony of death. Riders learned to shut out fear, but many broke under the strain. Some froze, unable to dismount when ordered. Others developed fatalistic mindsets, convinced each ride was their last. At night, the nightmares began. Visions of fire, of comrades screaming as they burned, of leaping too late. Survivors described the psychological scars as worse than the wounds themselves. Even decades later, many never spoke of their experiences, haunted by the knowledge that their role was essentially that of human armor, expendable, replaceable, and forgotten. For tank riders, the true battle wasn't just against bullets and shells, but against the crushing weight of fear and inevitability. While propaganda posters showed Soviet tank crews and riders as brothers in arms, the reality was far more complicated. Tank crews often viewed the infantry clinging to their machines as a liability. Extra weight that slowed maneuvering, extra bodies that drew enemy fire, and extra risks when explosions knocked riders into the path of the treads. From inside the armored hull, tankers had the illusion of protection, while the riders were fully exposed. This created a deep divide. For the riders, resentment was just as strong. They looked at the men inside the steel cocoon and saw safety, heat in the winter, and shelter from rain and shrapnel. By contrast, they sat outside in freezing winds, soaked by rain, or cooked alive by the heat radiating from the engine deck. Tank crews sometimes refused to slow down to help riders dismount properly, leaving men tumbling into chaos. Riders sometimes cursed the tankers, blaming them when entire squads were cut down. Yet despite this tension, survival demanded cooperation. Tankers needed riders to flush out enemy infantry, who could easily ambush and destroy tanks with mines, grenades, or anti-tank rifles. Riders needed tanks to smash defenses and provide at least some measure of firepower protection. This uneasy partnership meant that while bitter feelings simmered, both sides fought and often died together. Still, the scars of mistrust remained, adding another layer of suffering to an already suicidal role. On the Eastern Front, winter was its own executioner. Tank riders were often ordered into action during blizzards or freezing nights, clinging to steel that became as cold as ice. Many suffered frostbite, their fingers literally sticking to metal surfaces. Others froze solid on long night marches, their lifeless bodies discovered only when the tanks finally stopped. Exhaustion was another killer. Soldiers rode into battle after days with little food or rest, sometimes collapsing on the moving tanks from sheer fatigue. Those who fell asleep could slip and tumble under the tracks, crushed instantly by the very machines meant to carry them forward. Even in summer, extreme heat rising from the engines scorched men's legs, and dehydration left them weak before the fighting even began. Starvation compounded the misery. Supplies rarely kept up with the Red Army's rapid advances, and riders often went hungry for days. Some gnawed at frozen bread or raw potatoes while clinging to the armor, their stomachs empty as they rolled toward another engagement. Nature was as merciless as the Germans. Mud, snow, cold, and hunger constantly thinned the ranks before enemy bullets even arrived. For many tank riders, survival had less to do with combat skill and more with sheer luck against the environment. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Soviet infantrymen had served and died as tank riders. Their casualty rates were among the highest of any role in the Red Army, yet their sacrifice was rarely given the recognition it deserved. They were seen as expendable, part of a doctrine that valued overwhelming force over individual survival. To the Soviet command, they were shock troops, living extensions of the tank, meant to absorb the first waves of fire and clear the way for armored breakthroughs. But to those who survived, the memories were unforgettable. Veterans remembered not the glory shown in films or parades, but the smell of scorched flesh on the armor, the sound of comrades screaming as they fell, and the cold emptiness of watching friends disappear one by one. Many carried those scars silently for decades, overshadowed by the Red Army's victory narrative. Their legacy today is one of tragic heroism. They were men ordered into impossible situations, knowing their odds of survival were slim, yet climbing onto those steel beasts anyway. The tank riders of the Eastern Front became symbols of both Soviet resilience and Soviet ruthlessness, heroes to some, victims to others. Above all, they remain a haunting reminder of the brutal truth of total war. Sometimes, victory is built not on strategy or genius, but on the backs of men sent forward with no expectation of coming back.